When it came to struggle and death, Hitler reigned supreme. Ruler of the kingdom of death. Proclaimer of a murderous Weltanschauung. He had people killed simply because he had declared them enemies of his folk. That is what set Hitler apart as a criminal.
Ich glaube nicht, dass die Gegner, die damals noch gelacht haben, heute auch noch lachen.
Vienna after the turn of the century. The surface splendor of the metropolis was deceptive. In the shabby milieu of men's hostels, the young Hitler led a wretched life, with no real profession, teetering on the brink of oblivion. A complete contrast to the impact he would soon make. Society had cast him aside for the time being. The reject sought salvation and support from people he could take as models, like the renegade monk from Upper Austria, Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels. From his monastery in Werfenstein, Lanz propounded an obscure Aryan ideal. Are you blonde? Then you are a creator and preserver of civilization. Lanz's Ostara publications identified the enemy of the race, the Jews. Evil fantasies. For Hitler the outsider, the first outlines of a barbarous worldview. August the 2nd, 1914. Amongst the crowd, filmed quite by chance, the happy, excited face of a man who finally knew where he belonged. The First World War offered Hitler the opportunity to break free from the long string of personal defeats, destroyed hopes, and inner isolation. The war. It helped the 25-year-old to flee into the apparent security of a community. This was his world from now on, the safe place he had always sought. Four years of war left their mark on Hitler's social consciousness. You survive only through brutal self-assertion. Humanitarianism is weakness. Coldness is strength. With this lesson, Hitler returned from the war. By the time the German Empire collapsed, the foundations for Hitler's criminality had been laid. But his career as a criminal began only with his entry into politics. A scene from the summer of 1919. The man stepping out from the crowd on the left is Adolf Hitler. Deeply affected by Germany's defeat, he composed his first political pamphlet. There he says, for Hitler, all Jews were traitors to the fatherland. To be blamed for its collapse, to be blamed above all for that treacherous death blow to the old order, the November Revolution. Munich revolutionaries such as Ernst Mühsam, Kurt Eisner, Ernst Toller. To him, these Jews were the poison that is eating away at our people. The foundation for Hitler's Weltanschauung was laid 4 years later in Landsberg prison after his failed beer hall putsch of November 1923. Here he dictated Mein Kampf to Rudolf Hess. According to Hitler, it was the historic vision of future events, a detailed guide to state-sanctioned criminality. contempt for democracy and humanity, glorification of war, nationalistic intolerance, hatred of the Jews. In his book, Hitler set out the full range of his obsessions and dark symbolism. The author reveals himself as a future mass murderer.
If at the beginning of the war and during the war we had subjected 12 or 15,000 of these Hebrew corrupters of the people to poison gas, just as hundreds of thousands of our finest German workers of all classes and professions had to suffer on the battlefield, the sacrifice made at the front by millions of our people would not have been in vain.
In the mid-1920s, many German Jews were convinced that their time as second-class citizens was over. The Weimar Constitution guaranteed them freedom and equality, and they identified with this state which had integrated them so unconditionally.
Ich freue mich außerordentlich, in Deutschland und speziell in meiner Geburtsstadt Berlin zu sein.
Wir haben zu der Zeit oft genug gesagt, Mensch, jüdisch sein ist doch eine Religion, ist doch nichts weiter als das. Das konnten viele gar nicht verstehen. Bist du Deutscher oder bist du Jude? Dass es beide ein und dasselbe sein könnte, das scheint vielen gar nicht in den Kopf gegangen zu sein.
Many Jews were patriots, firmly rooted in German culture and society. Many sealed their emancipation with marriages to Christians, more than 50% before Hitler came to power. Loyalty to everything that was German, even the hijinks. Many German Jews wanted to be Germans first, then Jews. But this man had other ideas.
Wir können glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft restlos uns gehört.
Für einen jungen Kerl ist das sehr anziehend. Ja. Und ich frage mich immer noch, wäre ich kein Jude gewesen, wäre ich auch ein Deutscher und wäre ich später in der Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler gewesen und hätte auch gemördert wie alle anderen, frage ich mich immer. Zum Glück ist das nicht geschehen.
With Hitler's rise to power in 1933, German Jews became fair game for the Nazis.
Sie sollen sich hüten. Einmal wird unsere Geduld zu Ende sein und dann wird den Juden das freche Lügenmaul gestopft werden.
His Führer turned that threat into action. At this stage, Hitler still wanted to use legal means to force the Jews out of Germany. It was 0 hour for the criminal. The first step, a temporary boycott of Jewish businesses. Hitler appointed the Jew-hater Julius Streicher stage manager of the campaign.
Ein Volk, das nicht auf die Reinheit seiner Rasse hält, geht zugrunde.
The Jews defamed in Streicher's smear sheet Stürmer were not the only victims of persecution. Hitler hated on principle anyone who thought differently from him. Communists, Social Democrats, homosexuals, gypsies and Jehovah's Witnesses.
Ich denke, dass das Leute, die Politiker sind, Kirchenführer, Gewerkschaftsführer, Universitäten, die hätten erkennen sollen frühzeitig, und das ist einer meiner Hauptpunkte hier, dass Hitler ein tief unmoralischer Mensch war und seine Bewegung tief unmoralisch und von Anfang an mörderisch. Und das Kompromiss war einfach, glaube ich, weil in der deutschen Tradition die tiefe Verankerung des Respekts für Menschenrechte gefehlt hat.
For the dictator's opponents, the first place of torture was established at the end of March, the Dachau concentration camp. The agents of terror were the SA and the SS. Hitler made them the legal enforcers of his unjust policy. The concentration camp, known as an institute of re-education, it was the seed of later mass extermination.
Das Perfide, das mir persönlich widerfahren ist, das war für mich als junger Mensch, dass ich kein Mensch war in ihren Augen. Bei jedem Blick, den man dann ihnen zuwarf, der ihnen nicht gepasst hat, oder wenn sie geglaubt haben, die Bewegung ist zu langsam, haben sie sich auf einen gestürzt und haben einen zusammengeschlagen, haben eine Meldung gemacht, wenn sie gerade notwendig ihre Zahl wieder an Meldungen auffrischen wollten. Und man hat immer das Gefühl gehabt, jeder von diesen SS-Leuten kann dein zukünftiger Mörder sein, weil keiner war berechenbar.
The man who unleashed all this criminal energy showed his true colors when dealing with supposed opponents from his own ranks. Hitler made murder an instrument of government policy. In the early morning of June 30th, 1934, at Bad Wiessee, Operation Hummingbird was led against Ernst Röhm, head of the SA stormtroopers, by none other than the Führer himself. 7:10, SS men opened the door to the stairway of the Hanselbauer Hotel. Hitler storms up the stairs to the first floor. Flanked by the SS, he searches for Röhm's room, number 31. Half asleep, the SA chief recognizes the man standing in front of him. "Out," shouts Hitler. "I'm arresting you for high treason." "200 out-of-favor victims, not only SA leaders, suffered the same fate as Röhm. They were liquidated, and the killings subsequently declared lawful. Only now was his seizure of power complete. Only now did he have untrammeled power over life and death. All the authority of the state was vested in him.
Und es soll jeder für alle Zukunft wissen, dass wenn die Hand zum Schlag, den ins Stade hebt, sichere Tod sein Los ist.
And who was the state? He was. The next phase of state violence was directed once more against the Jews. The terror intensified year by year with each new decree. The law on the protection of German blood and German honor, the Reich Civil Code, the prohibition on Jews practicing as doctors, artists, journalists, and professors, all drastically restricted the lives of the German Jews. The new Nazi culture, the Volkskultur, made do without them. Aryan film stars told people what they were playing at.
Wir spielen hier einen Schauspieler seiner Zeit, in der Pflicht und Opfer ein Volk groß machten. Auch unsere Zeit erfordert Pflicht und Opfer.
German versus Jewish. In everyday life, people became increasingly forced to distance themselves from their Jewish neighbors. Hitler's goal, a Jew-free Reich. The trains were full of Jews fleeing from Nazi Germany. By the beginning of 1938, more than a quarter of them had left their homeland. It was a lot, but not enough for Hitler. Hitler directed the persecutions from his Berchtesgaden idyll. He gave only spoken instructions to his henchmen. Nothing was put in writing. Thus Hitler himself never appeared personally responsible. Vienna's Jewish quarter. About 180,000 people lived here, a tenth of the city's population. Fear spread in mid-March 1938. The nightmare of the Anschluss. Hitler's dream. Triumphal entry into the city, scene of his greatest defeats 3 decades earlier. The place where the seed for his hatred of the Jews had been sown. Hitler brought with him his enforcer, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS. He immediately had 67,000 enemies of the Reich placed under detention. After the annexation of Austria, there were suddenly as many Jews living in Greater Germany as there had been in Germany alone in 1933, 600,000 in all. Now hysteria was whipped up, the aim, to throw the Jews out. With approval from the highest quarters, the mob rampaged through the streets of Vienna. All Jews were to be forced to leave Greater Germany. Many were willing to go, but where? He just wanted them gone. He didn't care how or where. In October 1938, deportations began. With Hitler's approval, the Foreign Ministry ordered the expulsion of 17,000 Polish Jews living in Germany. Amongst them, the Grinspan family. Their youngest son, Herschel, had just started studying in Paris when he heard of the fate of his relatives. In his fury, he acquired a revolver, gained admission to the German embassy, and shot dead the embassy secretary, Ernst vom Rath. Grinspan's act of revenge prompted Goebbels, with Hitler's approval, to an unparalleled campaign of violence against the Jews. On the night of November the 9th, 200 synagogues in Germany went up in flames and thousands of Jewish shops were plundered. The broken windows everywhere gave the pogrom the cynical name Kristallnacht. The Aryan public stayed out of it by and large. Their entertainment that night, Heinz Rühmann in the 13 Chairs.
Herr Professor, in Ihrem Schrank ist ein Mann.
Na, macht das Freude? Bist du im Stuhl herumgewühlt? Der Herr zerschneidet meine Stühle, aber wirklich ausgezeichnet. Das freut mich aber.
Wenn die Herren gestatten, dann möchte ich jetzt gehen.
Hitler didn't like pogroms running wild. He wanted to torment the Jews systematically, under state control. He put Hermann Göring in charge of the official persecution of the Jews. The future Reichsmarschall knew what his Führer expected of him, the complete, systematic and ruthless expulsion of all Jews from the German Reich. But Hitler was already thinking ahead, and Göring quoted his master.
If the German Reich enters into a foreign policy conflict in the near future, it goes without saying that we in Germany will also be thinking primarily about settling our score with the Jews.
The strategist of violence was Reinhard Heydrich. He turned Hitler's dark declarations of intent into practical plans. The form of the final solution to the Jewish problem began to emerge at the end of November 1938.
At this stage of development, we are faced with the harsh necessity of exterminating the Jewish underworld, just as we exterminate criminals in our state of law and order with fire and sword. The result would be the actual and final end of the Jews in Germany, their total annihilation.
Hitler's impatience found its first public expression in a speech to the Reichstag with far-reaching effects.
Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
Now the connection between war and their extermination was patently obvious to every last German Jew. What most of his contemporaries dismissed as one of Hitler's mad assertions became practicable at the beginning of 1939. What nobody knew. In an address to the Army's group commanders, Hitler went one step further. The next struggle will be a war purely of Weltanschauung, that is, intentionally a war of Volk and race. Hitler's curse first came down on the Jews of Czechoslovakia. After the collapse of the Munich Pact, they were deported in their thousands. Anyone who saw any chance of getting out in the summer of 1939 fled. A particularly tragic chapter was the Odyssey of the St. Louis, a steamer to freedom headed for Havana with 1,000 passengers on board. Hopes of a new life, with dearly bought visas and 10 Reichsmarks in their pockets.
Glauben Sie mir, als wir von Hamburg abgefahren sind, da war eine Kapelle unten am Dings und haben gespielt, muss ich denn aus dem Städtelein raus. Meine Eltern hatten Tränen im Augen gehabt. Für mich, das war eine der größten Freude, um raus aus Deutschland, um ein neues Leben zu machen, wo wir keine Gefahr mehr hatten, wo Menschen mich nicht mehr anpöbeln wollten. Und ich habe mir versprochen, wenn mich jemand noch wieder im neuen Land ein dreckige Jude nannt, schlage ich ihm in die Schnauze sozusagen. Ich bin genauso ein Mensch wie alle anderen.
Hitler was relaxing in his Alpine home. In a few weeks, there would be war. Meantime, the St. Louis was heading for Cuba. In Havana, a nasty surprise awaited the passengers. They were not allowed to disembark. Relatives who had come to the port could do nothing for their loved ones. Nobody wanted them. The steamer had to return to Europe.
Ich stand dort auf dem Schiff und plötzlich ist ein Mann rausgelaufen mit dem Blut ist ihm von den Adern gelaufen und er ist dann ins Wasser gesprungen. Er wurde von einem von den Matrosen gerettet, aber er wollte eigentlich nicht gerettet werden, denn er hat sich versucht, die Adern rauszureißen. Aber er wurde ins Krankenhaus in Kuba genommen, aber seine Familie durfte ihn nicht besuchen dort.
The 1,000 homeless Jews returned to a trap. In Antwerp, their odyssey was over for the time being, but they had not escaped. 80% of these people would not survive the year 1945. The war began and concealed the injustice. On September the 1st, Hitler signed his only written authorization for state-sanctioned mass murder, not yet of the Jews, but of the so-called mentally ill. Euthanasia, they called it, really eugenics. The eradication of lives unfit for living. 75,000 were killed. Propaganda films like The Legacy were commissioned by Hitler in person and had to be shown in all German cinemas.
In Deutschland allein müssen über 700 Millionen Mark jährlich für solche Unglücklichen aufgebracht werden.
Examples from the animal world were said to prove that the weaker have to be killed.
Selbst unter gleichen Artgenossen finden Kämpfe statt, denen der Schlechtere zum Opfer fällt.
Contempt for everything of inferior quality is contrasted with the heroic existence of the racially pure human type.
Nur ein gesundes und starkes Volk wird leben und Werte schaffen zum Segen der Nation und zum Segen der Welt.
Protests by the church put an end to this program of murder. Would Hitler have also reacted to resistance to the mass murder of the Jews? With the beginning of the war, this new order was translated into action. Poland became the first scene of the crime. Exterminate, wipe out, annihilate. The individual counted for nothing. In March 1941, Hitler made his top officers his accomplices for the next crime in the Soviet Union. None of them spoke against it.
We must distance ourselves from the attitude of soldierly comradeship. The communist was no comrade before and will be no comrade after. This will be a war of annihilation.
He issued the so-called Commissar Order, the liquidation of all Soviet leadership, both military and civilian. So, not just the Jews. Hitler, the war criminal, and Hitler, the mass murderer, became one. Propaganda used film to try to win over the German people to Hitler's insane objectives.
Sie sind hinterlistig, feige und grausam und treten meist in großen Scharen auf. Sie stellen unter den Tieren das Element der heimtückischen unterirdischen Zerstörung dar. Nicht anders als die Juden unter den Menschen.
The propaganda implicitly points to genocide. But that had not been decided yet. Hitler only dared do what seemed feasible at the time. The next stage was the creation of the ghettos. Because it was impossible to expel all the Jews, they were penned up in their own districts. Warsaw. The Jewish quarter had 40,000 inhabitants before the war. Hitler's helpers turned it into a ghetto of 500,000 people. In October 1940, the ghetto was walled in because of the alleged danger of epidemics.
Well, it was a terrible feeling. It was a feeling of being in a trap, of being caught in a trap. There was no way out. And we were completely helpless.
Hans Frank, Hitler's governor in Poland, set the ration at 184 calories per person per day.
You know, death from hunger is terrible. It takes a long time for somebody to die of starvation, a very long time. And it's a very painful death.
The greatest human trap in history, starvation and epidemics. More than 100,000 Jews had already died before the first train left for Auschwitz. In the spring of 1941, Hitler withdrew to his mountain idyll. Here his decision took shape for a radical solution to the Jewish question. March the 13th, 1941. The first tangible indication of Hitler's new extremism was his guidelines for special areas for the future Russian campaign. On behalf of the Führer, only one force should have the say behind the lines, the SS. March the 30th, 1941. Before high-ranking Wehrmacht officers, the commander-in-chief set out what his troops were to do in the occupied East. And shortly after, to Reichsleiter Alfred Rosenberg, who confided, appalled, to his diary, "There is something I do not want to write down today, but will never forget." Also in March, Governor General Hans Frank was summoned to Berlin by Hitler. Poland will be the first area to be free of the Jews, the Führer told him. A little later, Adolf Eichmann noted,
Party comrade Heydrich has been appointed Polish Governor-General by the Führer for the final evacuation of the German Jews.
Final evacuation of the Jews, and at the same time, creating a Jew-free Poland. Here was the first impulse to actually carrying out genocide. Exactly 2 months later, Reinhard Heydrich issued a decree which said, "In future, the emigration of Jews is to be prevented in view of the doubtlessly imminent final solution of the Jewish problem." Hitler broke his pact with Stalin on June the 22nd. The army's rapid advance accelerated the start and extent of the mass destruction. Hitler's order to kill initially referred only to the Jewish Bolshevist functionaries, but by July 1941, all the Jews in the East were on the hit list. Hitler wanted genocide, but it had to be systematic. The first documented indication is an instruction from Goering on July the 31st, 1941. He authorized Heydrich to make all necessary organizational, practical and material preparations for a complete solution of the Jewish question in the area of German influence in Europe. Goering would never have been able to issue this order without Hitler's approval. Once the dictator had made up his mind, he left it to his helpers and his helpers' helpers to take action. But he made very sure his name could not be connected with the decision to murder the Jews.
I think the mystery, the greater mystery, lies in the fact that the whole nation followed him so blindly. And that all these acts of absolute inhumanity were perpetrated by people who were otherwise, as we all know, normal citizens, fathers of families, good to children, good to animals, you know, liking their homes and their gardens. And for me, the fascinating thing is, how do you reconcile this and what they did to the population outside when they left the church, or whatever?
The so-called final solution posed an organizational challenge. Hitler's obedient henchmen took care of the choice of murder sites, the methods of killing, and the ways of covering it all up. Riga on the Daugava, capital of Latvia. After the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the ghettos in the occupied countries only served as holding areas on the way to death. Like here, in the Rumbula forest near Riga, where the death squads went directly into action. Beginning in autumn 1941, mass executions were intended to solve the Jewish question on the spot. In one of the biggest single massacres, on one November day, more than 15,000 men, women and children were murdered. At the end of 1941, the mass murder entered a new phase. Occupied Russia now became a destination for Jews deported from the German Reich. They were transported over long distances, straight to the death squads in the Baltic. Here, in an old Tsarist fortress, Fort 9 at Kaunas in Lithuania, on November the 25th, 1941, Special Commando No. 3 from Einsatzgruppe A murdered the first 2,934 German Jews, deported from Frankfurt, Munich, and Berlin. Also involved in the crimes, the German Wehrmacht.
Die SD und die Einsatzkommandos und die Einsatzgruppen, ja, die sind mit dem Front mitgegangen und haben hinterlassen eine Lücke, ja, weil sie gar nicht so viel Personal, ich sage es ganz einfach Personal, nicht so viel Kräfte gehabt, um diese vorgenommene Zahl von Juden zu töten. Und das hat besorgt die Wehrmacht.
Was diese ganze Sache angeht, muss man sich wenden, und zwar mit aller Schärfe wenden, gegen die sehr geschickt vorangetriebene Pauschalisierung der Vorwürfe, also der Erfassung eigentlich aller früheren Wehrmachtangehörigen in den Vorwürfen. Denn das ist also, weiß Gott, in jeder Weise falsch und außerdem eine Demütigung und Erniedrigung fast aller Soldaten.
Das stimmt schon mit der ordentlichen Wehrmacht. Die waren schon ordentlich, die Leute. Was ich allerdings dann später im Krieg miterlebt habe, das sah anders aus.
The state crimes carried out on Hitler's behalf were top secret, but they did not always remain so. Soldiers on leave from the front brought home rumors that had been quietly going the rounds. Soon the murderers reached the limit of their capacity. Zyklon B solved this problem. A disinfectant used as a murder weapon.
Weshalb es Juden und Bakterien und Läuse und Flöhe und Ungeziefer aller Art gibt, ich weiß es nicht. Juda wird und muss vernichtet werden. Das ist unser heiliger Glaube.
When the goal of Lebensraum in the East was on the verge of failure, events came to a head. Millions of people who stood in the way of Hitler's insane idea, a new means of killing which promised the most thorough solution, the pressures of time to which Hitler subjected himself. So, in autumn 41, the decision on the Holocaust was taken, the last dimension of mass murder. High-ranking officials met on January the 20th, 1942, under the chairmanship of Heydrich, to organize the mechanics of implementing the final solution. The meeting took place here, at Wannsee in Berlin. The infrastructure for assembly line mass murder was in place in the spring of 42. Belchets, Chelmno, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz were the first 6 extermination camps, abattoirs for people. Hitler realized his war of annihilation in the East could no longer be won. But the more frontline soldiers fell, the more he wanted to make the Jews pay. The bureaucrats of murder tried hard to carry out the wish of the Führer. To ensure the crime kept smoothly on course, they came up with a sophisticated system of deception. Every day, the Jewish councils had to meet a quota of 6,000 people for relocation, as it was officially called. The train went directly from the station to the death factories for labor deployment, as it was known in an SS euphemism. Mass murder by timetable. The state railway was an efficient assistant. January the 30th, Berlin to Auschwitz. 1,000 passengers. February the 6th, Bialystok to Auschwitz. 2,000 passengers. The prices were fixed, 4 pfennigs per passenger per kilometer. One-way ticket, no return. In mid-1943, Himmler demanded even more goods trains. He got them. The terminal for the final solution. Its creator had never visited the place where his murderous plan was carried out. The gas chambers. They looked like shower rooms. The people were advised to remove their clothing and remember the number on the hook, so they could find their things again later.
Die Menschen sind rein, sie haben noch gelacht, sie haben noch gefragt, wo sie sich befinden. Und wir mussten verschweigen und nicht sagen, was mit ihnen passieren wird.
The deception worked right up to the last moment.
Und als der Letzte rein ist, haben sie das Tor vermacht von draußen und sofort sind die 2 SS-Männer gelaufen und auf einen Stuhl durch das Fenster, das war ganz oben, reingeschmissen dem Zyklon-B. Und gleich haben wir gehört, die Geschrei. So hat es ein paar Minuten gedauert, 10 bis 15 Minuten. Nachher hat man von der anderen Seite, von dem Hof, aufgemacht 2 Tiere. Und wir haben das Befehl bekommen, schnell, schnell rausziehende Menschen. Im Krematorium konnte man nicht so viel, konnte man nur einen Tag 1000 Menschen verbrennen. Und die Gruben hat man 15.000 verbrennt, in die 3 Gruben. Das war sehr lange Gruben, vielleicht 6 bis 8 Meter lang und breit, 1,5, 2 Meter breit. Und so eine Grube hat man 1000 Menschen auf einmal reingeschmissen. Das hat gedauert Minuten, eine halbe Stunde waren sie alle verbrannt, teilweise verbrannt. Es waren noch einige Hände, Füße, was sind auf die Seite gefallen. Das musste man wieder auf das Feuer. Und es soll gar nichts bleiben von den Menschen, nur ein bisschen Asche.
Anyone not sent straight to the gas chamber was exploited as a slave laborer. Their use value to the German armaments industry was calculated exactly by the SS. Life expectancy, 9 months. Revenue from hiring, 6 marks per day. Deduction for accommodation and food, 60 pfennigs a day. 1,631 Reichsmarks. That's the profit a slave laborer generated. One more way to finance the war. At the end of 1942, Hitler set aside the mask of public reticence. To party functionaries in the Löwenbräu Beer Hall in Munich, he declared,
Sie werden sich nur erinnern an die Reichstagssitzung, in der ich erklärte, wenn das Judentum sich etwa einbildet, einen internationalen Weltkrieg zur Ausrottung der europäischen Rassen herbeiführen zu können, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Ausrottung der europäischen Rassen, sondern die Ausrottung des Judentums in Europa sein. Sie haben mich immer als Prophet ausgelacht. Von denen, die damals lachten, lachen heute unzählige nicht mehr. Die jetzt noch lachen, werden in einiger Zeit vielleicht auch nicht mehr lachen.
Stalingrad, the beginning of the end for his criminal megalomania. The road to defeat was already mapped out. For the Jews, nothing changed, with the massacres continuing on a daily basis. If anything, Hitler's military defeats increased his will to destroy. He continued with the war for one single reason above all: to cover up the genocide. Hitler's reward in defeat was to be the extermination of all Jews. As the Soviet troops marched on unchecked towards the west, Hitler instructed his henchmen to destroy all traces of earlier mass murders. Like here, in a forest near Vilnius, concentration camp inmates were forced to dig up the bodies of victims of the firing squads, work that lasted 2 years. More than 2 million corpses were subsequently incinerated. Those responsible were praised by SS Chief Himmler in a confidential speech for enduring the effects on their morale.
Das gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Das hatten wir jede Verteidigung. Das steht in unserem Programm drin. Ausschaltung, Ausrottung machen wir da. Gleichzeitig. Von euch werden die meisten wissen, was es heißt, wenn 100 Leichen besser gehen. Wenn 500 da liegen oder wenn 1000 da liegen. Und dies durchgehalten zu haben. Und dabei, abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen, anständig geblieben zu sein, hat uns hart gemacht und ist ein niemals genanntes und niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt.
What did people in Germany know?
Was wussten wir von Konzentrationslager? Wenn mir der eine gesagt hat, da werden Juden vergast, dann hätte ich gesagt, du spinnst wohl, weil du hast wohl nicht alle auf der Latte. Oder hätte ein Gesicht gespuckt sogar.
Mensch, das hat sich doch kein Mensch vorstellen können, dass man Menschen verbrennt.
Was aber dort vollzogen worden ist, was alles vorher dort geschah, die ganzen Verbrechen, davon wussten wir nichts.
Also wenigstens ich habe mich gewundert, dass dann die Leute mit dem Davidstern plötzlich immer weniger wurden. Und habe mir gesagt, wo gehen denn die alle hin? Wir haben immer gedacht, die werden wohl ausgewiesen oder die kommen wohl weg. Aber dass sie umgebracht werden, hat man nicht gewusst.
But many people knew enough to know full well that they didn't want to know anymore. By the time the Soviet army moved into Hitler's capital, the murderous work was almost complete. In his last weeks, the dictator held forth about war, Lebensraum, and the racial policy. He saw these as his real achievements. But in the closing phases of the war, it was not only against the Jews that Hitler's fanatical desire for destruction was directed. The Führer's last mass murder campaign was aimed at the Germans themselves. His people, who had ruined his destined role as conqueror of the world and proved to be unworthy of their mission. Hitler's death sentence.
The Germans should perish and be destroyed, because the people have proved themselves to be weaker, and the future belongs exclusively to the stronger people of the East.
With the so-called Nero Order of March the 19th, 1945, Hitler tried to rob Germany and the Germans of every chance of survival. The destruction of the very groundwork of existence, Hitler's last order for annihilation. For 6 weeks, National Socialist fanatics competed with Allied air forces and artillery to smash the foundations of life in Germany. It was too short a time for the Germans themselves to be affected by the full force of the fate intended for them. But long enough to expose another side to Adolf Hitler the criminal, a traitor to his own people. Traitor and criminal. The traces of Hitler's violence are still to be found everywhere. The genocide of the Second World War. That was his decision. But it could only have been carried out with the help of thousands and thousands of accomplices. The 20th century fall of man. Since Hitler, we know what people are capable of doing to each other.